This program has been approved for one IDCEC CEU. To receive credit for this program, please submit your full name, IDCEC number, program class code, and your summary essay to CEU@IIDA.org. The program class code is located alongside the title of this program on the IIDA Academy page. For a certificate of completion to use toward another certifying body, please submit the same information to CEU@IIDA.org. Thank you.
Welcome to the 5th season of IIDA's Collective Design Series. I'm Cheryl Durst, Executive Vice President and CEO of IIDA, and I'm so glad you could join us as we kick off this new season of our signature knowledge sharing series. In fact, I hope you're already planning to spend a little time with collective design throughout the year. Keep an eye on those IIDA channels for more details about the rest of the season. We have some truly stellar programs and speakers lined up just for you. And speaking of superstars, our kickoff speaker for this season is urban revitalization strategist, MacArthur Fellow, and lecturer at Princeton's Keller Center, Majora Carter. Majora is also a good friend to IIDA and has been a Star Award winner and a Leaders Breakfast honoree. Majora was born and raised in the South Bronx, where she began a career that has centered on community and equity. Her work has resulted in the creation of numerous economic development, technology inclusion, and green infrastructure projects, as well as job training and placement systems within communities. She is the author of Reclaiming Your Community, a book whose subtitle appears as an iconic Majora quote on the walls of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. She says, "Nobody should have to move out of their neighborhood to live in a better one." Enjoy Majora's presentation and then stick around afterward for my discussion with IIDA Board President Ronnie Belizaire and the International Well Building Institute's Community Concept Lead, Dr. Angie Scott. And if you're looking for CEU information, it will come at the end of the program. Thanks so much for joining us. See you soon.
Hello, IIDA. First of all, I am super excited to be here. And I just wanted to introduce you to my little friend. This was the Star Award that I received actually quite a few years ago from IIDA. And so I am a huge fan, not just because you give me awards, but because I love the work that you do. And I'm real excited to be a part of this. Now I need to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. Ta-da! 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 Here we go. Okay. So for those of you that don't know my work, I also just wrote a book. Oh no, it's over a year old at this point, but it's called Reclaiming Your Community. You don't have to move out of your neighborhood to live in a better one. And I did this thing where I decided to put my glossary up in literally, it's before the first prologue, in my book. And I did it because I really wanted people to know exactly what I was talking about when I talked about it in the rest of the book. So there's 2 phrases I want you to know to start, just so there's no confusion. One, I use a term called the nonprofit industrial complex. And it's a collection of the philanthropic and corporate funders, often government agencies, and of course the nonprofit organizations that feed off the existence of inequality, and actually sort of benefit from it at times. And obviously that doesn't mean everybody who's in the nonprofit world does that, but you have to admit, as part of a industrial complex, that there's definitely, it works to exist to feed off of itself. And the motivation is not there to really solve equality. And then another term that I use is one called low status communities. And these are the communities that are generally referred to as poor or low income or underprivileged, under-resourced, all the terms. We use low status because status implies that something larger is at work, and that inequality is in and of itself a well-established fact. And these are the places where schools and public health, air and water quality, even trees and parks or food options are worse there than they are in other parts of the same town or city. Think of those communities like that near you. They could be Native American reservations. They could be inner cities. They could even be poor white towns where there was once some industry that actually gave people jobs, but no longer. But what they all have in common is that the bright kids who grew up in those places, whether they're artistically or academically or even athletically inclined, they're led to believe that they need to grow up and get out of those communities. They are literally measuring success by how far they get away. And so they're in urban or suburban or rural areas. They're all over the place. But those are they're the places where inequality is assumed by those who live both inside the community and those on the outside looking in on them. And this talk is about our approach to community development, which uses a talent retention strategy. And so think about it. Successful companies, they don't hire people, talent, to pull them into their company and support them, with benefits or company or time off or all sorts of fun things like that, just to make just so their competition can hire them away. No, they want the people that they bring in to lean in and really take what they're doing as a mission of that company seriously. And so, and also, yes, of course, nobody really wants to train and have to rehire people at all. But all that to say is that you really are trying to inspire people to grow, with the company. And so that their bottom line, but the individual's bottom line also becomes the company's bottom line. So we want to think about that. And because successful companies practice talent retention, for all sorts of reasons. But mostly because they don't want to spend money so that somebody else can hire them away. But yet we spend billions of dollars philanthropically, through government spending, even private dollars. They're spent in low status communities to allegedly support the people in them, yet outcomes really don't get much better. So we don't really do much to retain the talent that's born and raised in those communities, because rest assured, plenty of talented people grow up in these communities. America loves the Cinderella story of somebody coming from, a hardscrabble neighborhood and then, growing up and being somebody, but which would lead you to believe that there's always talent no matter where you are. And so we definitely believe that. And so we believe that talent retention, the same tool that's used in the corporate world, can be used to promote really great neighborhoods in low status communities for the people that were born and raised in them. And so my hometown in the South Bronx, I would say definitely did not have a talent retention strategy. One could honestly say that it was a talent repulsion strategy. So this was the South Bronx that I grew up in back in the 1970s and 80s. This was when, crack epidemic was looming. There were financial disinvestment. The time was called the Bronx is Burning history, and this was a crack house that I walked by on my way to school, which took me to the subway, which took me to one of the best high schools in the country called the Bronx High School of Science. And so seeing this kind of made me think, yeah, I don't really want to have to be here. But when my family, my dad in particular, moved to the neighborhood back in the early 1940s, it was a much different place. At the time, then later on he married my mom and she moved in with him. I think she's pregnant with my oldest brother in that photo. And so it was a mostly white working class community. And, people would walk to work because there was the residential section right next to the industrial section. But then Black folks from down south, and then Black and brown folks from the Caribbean also followed suit, looking for their great American dream. White flight happened. And the highway construction boom was also definitely starting to take hold. This is a photo of the Cross Bronx Expressway as it was being built, and it kind of looks like a gash because it was. It literally just destroyed whole neighborhoods underneath it, and thriving businesses, and that's what we saw. And redlining is a phrase or came out about the federal government started making these kind of rules around what would happen within these neighborhoods, in particular, like where areas would be good for development or not. And the banking industries followed suit and decided that they weren't going to loan, in those areas. And what considered blight in those areas was usually the presence of Black people. And so I grew up in 10474. And so this was some very interesting years of financial disinvestment. So if things like loans or mortgages were not coming, to the fore for the businesses and even the property owners that lived in those or had property in those neighborhoods, many of them just took their companies and went offshore, or to right to work states, where it was easier for them to actually do work. And sometimes, yeah. And so, but what took its place was a lot of this kind of like citywide waste, and then later on power plants, sewer treatment, and sewage sludge pelletizing plants. These were the type that became the new type of infrastructure that we saw, in our community, all of which had, an impact on the public health, just a general quality of life, and of course, environmental impacts, for the community. Oh, and this is around the time that I came in. I am positive that this was that I was on the phone with Santa Claus, and I'm telling him that the Easter Bunny says I've been a really good girl, so please take care of me at Christmas time. But this is what I grew up with. Again, all those years of financial disinvestment, of landlords not being able, to get any money for anything other than insurance money for their properties. Many of them actually had their buildings torched by arsonists so that they could get something out of them. And then, coupled with that is that these buildings were all built around the turn of last century. So there was definitely issues with faulty wiring, just like old buildings were starting to fall apart. But basically the South Bronx, because of the fires and just basic disinvestment, we lost about 60% of our population. People, most of them did not die in these fires. Most of them just moved out because there wasn't places to live. But we grew up seeing this type of this around and feeling like, wait a second, there is something wrong. And it was true. I mean, I was planning my escape around this time, when I was about 7 years old. My brother was killed at the beginning of one summer. And then the end of that same summer, both buildings on either end of my block burned down. And so that was enough for me to just be like, you know what, I am a smart kid and I'm going to get out of here. And guess what? That's what everybody told me. And despite the fact, that even though we knew that there were tons of wonderful people in our community, it was still just assumed that if you were a smart one, you got out. And, and I remember being a kid and just feeling like I never felt honestly unsafe or unloved, because there was always the community that was left that really supported the people that were there. And it's the same thing now. There's still amazing, wonderful folks within our communities. I mean, look, we're filmmakers, we are, designers, we work as entrepreneurs. There's medical professionals and legal professionals that were born and raised in the community and actually still live here. So to say that there isn't talent is just not at all true, because honestly, we've never had a problem with producing great talent in low status communities. We do have a problem with keeping it there. The young lady with the Cozaine with my rosé t-shirt it's a friend of mine named Noelle Santos, who has a wildly successful enterprise that she created by combining her two favorite things in the world, books and wine, and it's called the Lit Bar, as in lit like literature, lit like tipsy. And so she put them all together, and that's what she's gotten. Again, really amazing and wonderful. The gentleman, if any of you are foodies, that's Marcus Samuelson in the top left picture. Come and buys and visits every now and then. And the young man in the middle of the photo is our friend Christian Navarro. And so for those of you who have, like, I guess, teenage kids now, there was a really popular Netflix show called 13 Reasons Why that starred him as Tony Romero in his breakout role. And, now he's just a working actor, but he grew up right up the street from here, and his family's still here. So we get to see him every now and then too. But if we think about all that, I was still, even though now I'm here and I could introduce you to some of the people in my neighborhood, but back then, when I was, gone away to college and was just like, okay, I'm done. I use education to get out of here. The only reason why I came back home was because I needed a cheap place to stay when I started graduate school. And it was not the kind of thing that there was no love. Like, I would get up early in the morning and leave the neighborhood and not come back till really late at night, because I was just like, this neighborhood has nothing for me. But then I found out that the city was planning on building a huge waste facility, along our waterfront. And actually, this was after I discovered that, guess what? There were amazing people in my neighborhood. There was actually a great arts community. So I felt a little connected to it. And that's when I discovered that the city and state were building a huge waste facility on our waterfront. But having that education and some distance really also helped me understand that the things that we were getting here, because that waste facility just added insult to injury to all of the rest of the facilities that were already here. We were at that point handling about almost 40% of the city's commercial waste. And so I was just like, wait a second, it is because we're a poor community of color and thus politically vulnerable that all of this is continuing to happen. And it was a really difficult time, I have to say, to like take that in. But that's when I realized I could either pretend I don't see it, or I could be a part of the change I really wanted to see in my community. Because at that point, I did start to love it and appreciate the people that were here, at that time. And so I wanted to be a part of that change. And so seeing that, I did start working on creating a much more comprehensive, solid waste management plan that didn't disproportionately discriminate against poor communities of color here in the city. But that was definitely a fight that needed to be fought. But I also felt like, what are we dreaming about, in our own communities? What kind of communities do we want to be a part of? And having listened, to our neighbors talking, we knew that many of of the parents in the community and just people in general were leaving the neighborhood, in order to like take their kids to parks or things like that. And so we were just like, so not just what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for? And so I really didn't know what that meant, but I knew that we needed to do something. And it just so happened to come in the guise of a woman who was working with the New York City Parks Department through the National Park Service, around developing projects that would impact urban threatened rivers. And the Bronx River, only true freshwater river in all of New York, was definitely urban and certainly threatened by a whole bunch of stuff, environmentally and otherwise coming down the pipe. And so these were to do restoration projects, or at least, public education projects. So we kept getting visited by this woman named Jenny Hoffner, who was just because she knew of our other advocacy in the community, was just like, look, there's this grant program, try, apply for it. And I was just like, mostly because I knew we had a Bronx River because I saw it on a subway map, but I'd actually never seen it because there was so much industry, or just dumps lining the water. And fortunately for me and my community at the time, I had a crazy dog that pulled me into what I thought was just another illegal garbage dump along the waterfront. And that turns out that it was insane, because we saw that after Zena, her name was Zena, pulled me into what I thought was just another dump. And honestly, if I didn't have an 80-pound crazy dog with me, there is no way I would have gone in there by myself, because there were weeds and piles of garbage over my head and like things that are just like super not pleasant to be around. But went into it. But when we got to the end of what I thought was just a dump, it sort of like the space cleared and there was this beautiful expanse of water. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. And it was like 6 a.m. in the morning and the sunlight was just glinting off the water and it just looked so beautiful. I can't even tell you. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, you can get to the river from here. I mean, we have to deal with all that crap behind us, but you know what? Now I know. And so I went back, wrote that little proposal, got a little seed grant, to start doing some work there, and believe me, it was just as it was difficult for me to even think that there could be cool stuff like this in our neighborhood. It was just as hard for other folks as well to be like, oh yeah, sure, we're going to build a park down there. But it worked out, obviously, because we were able to do some cleanups and we got folks who's like really involved. Didn't matter who I spoke to help if the local utility had heavy equipment to come and pull some of the garbage out, great. I became really good friends with them. But this is what it looked like, after, oh gosh, many, many cleanups. And, and it was really, but honestly, even though folks had been like, yes, we want parks in the neighborhood, we did not have the experience in our neighborhood of going to parks. We just didn't. So we realized we had to build programming in order for on there to just entice people to come down to the water. And so boat building programs, we did like movie, we do pop-up movie screens and whatever we could do, canoe rides, just to get people down to the water so they could actually feel connected to it and make sure that they knew that it was a part of their community as well. And this is one of my favorite pictures in all of the universe. So you can see I'm simply posing because I was like, look, I just spent almost 7 years like working to get this thing ready. So for the groundbreaking, I just wanted my picture to be taken and, with the mayor and the parks, because they did some good stuff too, I guess. But so we went from this to this beta version here. And this is the Hunts Point Riverside Park as it exists right now. And it really is just like, I think, the apple of so many of our eyes, because it's become this incredible gathering place, within the community. And it has been remarkably beautiful, like this whole time. And, folks have really embraced it for what it is, which is, a tremendously beautiful part of their community that actually belongs to them. And I got married there back in 2006, and that is Xena, the dog who led me there. And yeah, it was just a great place to get married, and it's just really kind of sweet. And there's Xena with her well-deserved award. It's a national award for excellence in urban design, and frankly, would not have been possible without her. So thank you, Xena. But so here we had this beautiful spot, in our neighborhood. But still, we still heard from so many folks that this was not the place to be. And it was, if anything, it was just a launch pad for you to like measure your success by how far you got away. And I think nothing could have been more, apparent, to us around that, especially as we started doing market research on, which took the form of things like surveys and focus groups, asking people, what kind of community did they want to be in? Like as we were thinking about being a developer, we really wanted to do our own needs and desire assessments, for folks within the community to really understand, what they were looking for. And a big group that we spoke to were high school seniors, because what was wonderful was that around that time, we had more kids graduating high school and then going on to college than we've had in those few years than in the past 30. So the community, everybody was really proud of that fact, since it's been so long since we've been able to boast those kind of numbers. And so, but when we asked them, so what do you think the community needs now? And they would say almost to like a person. Oh, we need more affordable housing for really poor people, and we need some homeless shelters because that's where some of them are going to end up anyway. We need more health clinics because everybody here is really sick, diabetes, obesity, all that stuff. And we need more programs for the kids to keep them out of trouble, even though they weren't much older than the kids they were talking about. You know, and they were just really clear. It was just not a really pleasant thing of what they thought the neighborhood needed. And then we'd ask them, so, but we're super proud of you, and we know you're going to graduate high school, go to college, get yourself a career, make yourself some money. Are you going to come back here or to a neighborhood like it? And they were all, I mean, they would physically recoil in the way that only teenagers can do, that make you feel like this big. And they were just like, no, like, why would I do that? It's like, like you said it yourself, I'm gonna grow up and do something with my life. Why would I want to be here? So to them, all the things that they knew that they really knew that their community needed were markers of poverty that they wanted nothing to do with. And so, but because that was a really interesting thing for us, because we knew that that was also the same kind of thing that when you think about the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that we see this, the kind of developments and programs and policies that we see enacted in communities like this, it's almost as if poverty is a part of the culture, practically part of the DNA of a community. And you actually develop the community almost as if it's worth preserving. And so again, if we were asking those questions about to the community, you can't really ask them, is poverty a cultural attribute? Because that's like super policy wonky and not that interesting. But you certainly can ask them, you know, what are you looking for in the community you desire? And we were not surprised when they didn't list any of the things that they found objectionable about the community, but they listed all the things that pretty much everybody wants in their own community. You know, things like coffee shops and cafes and restaurants and bars. You know, they wanted, you know, arcades, they wanted fun places to hang out. They wanted housing that matched their income, because there are, you know, just the poverty, you know, communities that have high poverty doesn't mean that's all that's there. And so they wanted housing to match their income, you know, where they were. And maybe it could even be where they were now, which is this community. And because in part what they wanted to be was inspired by people like them, and also be an inspiration to others, because, you know, but you have to have places in which to do these things, none of which we had in our own community. So when we looked at this, we were just like, this is a really kind of fascinating thing that we knew was true. It's just like people, and you watch where people spent their money, they weren't spending it here. But if you think about it, there's only really two kinds of development that you see happening in low status communities. One is sort of like your typical gentrification, you know, route that we see. You know, so where I think the common way that it's described is that you have, you know, developers will come in, you know, like buy property off of the folks that own it, and then the place is developed for other folks, not like the original inhabitants of the neighborhood, or not original, but, you know, more recent. The other kind is something we call poverty level economic maintenance. And so, you know, you're in a low status community when you don't have like great diverse options for, you know, for food in particular, but you'll see plenty of greasy spoons or fast food joints, you know, or the kind of things that, you know, but you're not going to really see things like different restaurants or, you know, too many farmers markets or things like that. You'll see places you can spend your money. There are economic developments, but often they're the kind that make people wish that there were other places to shop. And if they have the opportunity to do so, they will. If your dollar stores or 99-cent stores are essentially your main retail option, you know, in a low status community, then that's what you know you're there. Low status communities themselves are a big portion of the balance sheet for pharmaceutical industries. So there's always places for you to get medication for whether it's diabetes, obesity. We see a lot of that happening. So you lots of pharmacies in communities like ours. And Oh yeah, but there's also plenty of places that get self-medicated, and you'll see it in the high, incidence of liquor stores that are often part of the economic development that you see on main streets within our communities. If you want to save or invest your money, it'll be difficult for you to do so within low status neighborhoods, simply because you really don't see banks or credit unions, certainly not at the extent that you'll see them in higher status neighborhoods, but you'll see places that charge you to use your own money. So check cashing stores, pawn shops, or rent-a-centers, payday loan places. And last but definitely not least, you will see very high concentrations of federally subsidized affordable housing, but specifically for the lowest income bands. And what I don't want people to think is that, it's like, geez, Majora Carter really hates poor people in poor neighborhoods. It's like, that's totally not true. But what I do hate, is the fact that this continued concentration of poverty in American cities in particular really does concentrate and exacerbate all the health outcomes that and low educational attainment and higher rates of people being involved in the justice system, more predatory speculation so that people are separated from their own assets. And really, it produces more of a lack of hope as well, because it makes people in these communities feel as though that there's nothing to look forward to in them. And if you look at the stats, they're right. However, so that's why we really believe that there is an opportunity here to look at our communities, as places where we can sort of like reconfigure the development of them so that we can show that there's some wonderful things happening. And because we know that there's like a big difference between, poverty level economic maintenance and gentrification. And there's something in the middle that can be healing to folks. But but folks are just, I've heard many folks say things like, oh, well, but if a neighborhood gets too good, then of course it's going to push people out. And you just know that things like gentrification, starts with things like coffee shops and things like that. And I'm here to tell you without a shadow of a doubt, that's not true. Gentrification actually starts long before when we have before you start seeing cute coffee shops and daycares, things like that. It really starts to happen, back when we believe that there's no value in our own communities. So these are actual notices and solicitations that I've received, under my door in the mail, from predatory speculators who believe that I don't know the value of my own home. And unfortunately, lots of folks don't, because they feel that since our neighborhoods have no value, yes, they'll sell early and cheap. And that's why this talent retention strategy is so important, for us to do as a community and as a developer. And so what does it look like in the real world? It actually looks like, first of all, it's beautiful, and there's a high quality built and natural environment, that there are commercially viable year-round spaces so that people can be seen and be beautiful, and also see, as well, other folks around them. It promotes community, but not like sort of like the kind of community center that a lot of developers will build into a project, which is basically just like a room that doesn't really inspire anything except people feeling like, I don't want to hang out there. And then there's quality housing for local residents, and again, in a range of incomes and good paying jobs and opportunities for entrepreneurial development. And nobody wants to have poverty conflated with their culture. So we're not having that, because we want to have a neighborhood where it feels good to be in it. So remember this this photo of my my walk. What it looked like as I walked to school or walked to the subway that took me to my high school. Well, this is the same location that we transformed into the Boogie Down Grind. So it didn't just go from Crack House to Boogie Down Grind, by the way. But Boogie Down Grind is our cafe, is one of the first iterations of a talent retention strategy. And so, since for those of you that don't know, the South Bronx is the birthplace of hip hop. Boogie Down is another name for the Bronx. And we, created this space, as an homage to our culture, which is hip hop, and use it as a space for people to show how fabulous they are. So we've got everything from open mics and poetry readings and poetry slams, and people will do credit repair workshops, book signings, book talks. They'll have like meetings. Teachers will have meetings. Well, they're right there. It's really kind of cool. And but even though the space is used by the community and folks know that it's absolutely for them, there are still folks who looked at cafes as sort of like the harbinger of gentrification. And even though I find that super ironic because, coffee literally comes from the blackest and brownest parts of this entire planet. And it is literally the blackest beverage on the planet. So I'm just saying, but to some folks, if it looks different, and if you've been led to believe that there's only one way or two ways to do community, none of which are really great for you, you're going to have a reaction. And so we were actually protested by, a group of, social justice folks, a small group, but they were loud, who accused us of essentially gentrifying and, our own community, which I thought was kind of interesting. And so we took that, as we were hoping as an opportunity to be like, let's talk a bit more about it. But what was super ironic, they didn't want to talk more, was that the night that we were protested was the same night that we were hosting a meeting for some lenders who were offering 0% loans for small business owners and low-income homeowners. I kid you not, we've taken advantage of them. So that's why we knew they existed and wanted to share it with our community. But it was just an odd kind of crazy thing. But what was so fascinating, because if you've ever been protested, and I hope you haven't been, everything kind of falls apart for a moment and you're just like, nobody's ever going to want to talk to me ever again. And we thought we might have to close the cafe. But I have to tell you, literally the next day we opened, we did better than we've ever done, like prior to that. And, more revenues, because people were just like, yo, I heard about that. That was stupid. We're just here to show some support. So, and it was really kind of wonderful to see that happen. And so we were psyched. But and this is one of the first investors in our cafe. She's a Honduran immigrant, her husband's from Jamaica, and it's just like this wonderful thing that you realize when you understand who you are and what you're doing and why. So it makes sense. And then there's this. So this is another project, and since I'm talking to a bunch of design heads there, some of you might be familiar with at least the person who designed this, Cass Gilbert, the same architect in the Woolworth building. Also did these little rail stations around the turn of the 20th century. And this is one that's happened to be in my neighborhood. And so, but when it closed, they closed to rail service over time. And then it was split into like these little mini storefronts. And turns out that the guy who owned the ground lease died with 20 years left on his lease. And after a while, it took Amtrak, who owned the building, a while to realize, like, wait, nobody's paying, even though honestly, for the entire building, 4,500 square feet, 5 different storefronts, it was a total of $9,000 a year to lease the whole thing. So it wasn't much. So again, it took them like a few minutes to realize, oh, wait, we haven't gotten a check from this man because he died. So after he passed, the place stayed vacant for a couple of years. And that's when I contacted Amtrak and said, listen, I'd like to acquire a long-term lease or just acquire the building, and ended up doing just that. But before we even did, we ended up, because it was getting graffitied up, and not like the cool graffiti, just this was not nice. And so we ended up hiring young people from the neighborhood to work with us, or rather to design, their own really simple, infographic mural. And it was really kind of sweet, just to make it a little nicer to walk by. And so now we are transforming that space, we ripped out everything in the middle, inside. With my husband and I actually started the interior demolition. It was really insane. And so this was what it looked like originally when it was built. And so during the process, and now we're transforming it into an event hall. And so far, even though, we're now on the National Register for Historic Places, we're going after historic tax credits, but we're still able to use the space as it is right now while we get all the rest of the financing together, et cetera. So we've been using it, whether it's pop-up shops or flea markets, as people of a certain age like me would call them. We've had photo shoots and video shoots of like all different kinds. It's been super cool. Malik Yoba, who is a Bronx-born actor, now real estate developer, and a filmmaker, he did an event called he did a series called I Build New York, and it's all about the real estate development in New York. And he has a focus on Black and brown developers. And yours truly was in the very first episode, which was kind of cool. And of course, we did the premiere at Bronxlandia, which is the name of this event hall. So it's super fun. And to have things like this here, we've done all sorts of amazing performances, TEDx's as well. Tarana Burke, when she published her second book, dropped it. The paperback version at Bronxlandia, which is super fun. And we've had pro wrestling events there too, which is like, if you've never seen a pro wrestling event in person, I swear it is one of the most fun things you could ever imagine. And so we're now, just again, going through the process. We're working with this amazing architecture firm called Studio V, who just loves both the restoration parts, but also like, how do you like bring it into the 21st century? As well. So like holding on to some of the original historic fabric, but frankly, a lot of the historic fabric's gone. So what do we do to just make sure that it's a beautiful place? So I am super excited, that we're, still working on this. And it's just, it's going soon. So if any of you are ever in New York, oh, and by the way, we're also doing a local real estate investment. So thanks to changes in the Security and Exchange Commission, small investors can actually, contribute and get the same rate of return for much larger investors in a project. So we're creating this opportunity so people from our community can actually, buy into, a little piece of commercial development within their own community. And just so that, the reason why I'm even in this was born actually is because my dad was a Pullman porter, and this was just at the tail end when rail stations were starting to close, but there was talk that this one would be reopened. And this was my father's main line. It was on the New York New Haven line. And keep in mind, this was in the late 1930s, early 1940s. He had won and he was a big Black man, okay, from down south. He'd won $15,000 in a horse race, back in California, carried cash back to New York City, went up on the subway, walked down and up on the streets of this neighborhood, and found an Italian family that was willing to sell their house directly to a big old Black man. And he bought it for cash. He did not feel safe enough living in the neighborhood at the time because it was mostly white and working class. And he hadn't met my mom and married her at that point. So when he met her, he's just like, look, we need a place to live. So he initially rented it back to the family that sold the property to him. But that's where I grew up, and that's why I was born. So thank you, Daddy. So I think of him every time I walk in there. The last job my dad had was as a janitor at this place, which was a horrible place. It's a juvenile detention facility. And it housed like all of New York City's juvenile offenders for a while. And it was finally closed down back in the early 20-teens. And, thank God, because it broke kids. I mean, I remember my dad talking about how he wished that our house was bigger so that we could take in some more kids, because sometimes kids were just put there because of stuff that their parents did. But, we didn't really have a good way of dealing with, we still don't, juvenile offenders or whatever. So when we talked about, but finally youth activists and prison reform folks literally got it closed down in the 20-teens. And and at this point I realized, like, wait a second, this was right around the corner from the house I grew up in, mind you. And I thought, this place is so big, it's 5 acres big. That's the scale at which you can build the kind of mixed income housing, mixed use commercial development with opportunities for home ownership, as well as as well as like commercial opportunities, that's where you can build that. So you can show what's possible. And so we looked at the site, for mixed income housing, mixed use commercial, all that stuff. We did economic analysis to see what are the growth trends for economic development so that people could have jobs as well as opportunities for business development. We looked at a lot at the fact that there's like manufacturing it's not our mom and dad's former manufacturing, but it's different from in tech and food and apparel as well. Public space, because that is the great democratizer. Good quality public space does create so much value, just like community and social opportunities to connect. It just makes communities safer, and commercial and retail, because you want your same dollars to circulate throughout the economy and make it so that people are buying as much as they can from that neighborhood and being employed by as many people from that community, so that again the dollars like stay in that neighborhood. And so we also realized that the ability for this type of development could actually be playing out in other types of post-industrial American cities around the country. And so, because we knew that there was like your industrial section right next up against the residential core. And in the case of this photo on the left side, you'll see the big building, which is Spofford, but that was the part that had the residential, on it. And then across the street, that's where the light industrial started. And on this particular block, it was a truck engine, repair shop. There was some illegal, like auto glass shops and things like that. But mostly what everybody knew was that this was the kind of place where truckers would go pick up a prostitute because it was so quiet. And but what would be different is if you with good uses would drive out bad uses, right? So what would happen if you had it's basically a 24-hour street, where there were 3 shifts, in some of the light manufacturing companies. There were entrances to apartments, there were entrances to schools and other types of local economic development. Good uses will drive out bad ones. And we loved this idea because what it did was not just say, oh, there's a nice little project, isn't that great? No, but we wanted to raise the bar for what passed for development within the local community, within communities and low-income communities and low-status communities like the South Bronx, and really raising that bar so that you could see what could happen. So in anticipation of the city issuing, a request for proposals for this, we put together an amazing team of, developers. There were more women and people of color in this very mixed team. And because I value diversity, I also had white men on our team as well. But it was amazing. And the program that we put together in this day was 1,200 units of mixed income housing, including 100-unit low income ownership project that Habitat for Humanity's New York City was planning to build. And there were 200,000 square feet that was dedicated for light manufacturing and commercial, residential, and cultural space. And we realized that all of the letters of interest of people who wanted to come, or companies that wanted to come or expand in New York City, would have brought about 800 jobs, into the community. And Lordy, Miss Claudie, it was a real tough one when we realized that New York City was not ready for us at all. We ended up, we lost the bid to a team, which was comprised of just 2 white male developers. And they decided to build little more than a low-income housing project with a big health clinic and a big community center. That was the winning bid. Fortunately, they did come back and create some space for some other light manufacturers, but they could have done so much better there. I said it. Yeah, I put it in the book, for the love of God. Of course, it's not like I hide it. But anyway, I'm just excited, that we're, in this space because, because I fully believe that this is a quote from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I love to close this because, I do feel impatient about moving toward an approach to community development that includes talent retention, that honors and respects the fact that we have never, ever, ever had a problem producing amazingly talented people from our community. We have, as a society, had a problem with keeping them in those communities so that they can reinvest into our own communities economically and socially, and spiritually. And instead, I feel like, we've sort of put ourselves in and gone down this road where we consistently act as if there's something wrong in our communities. And by association, if you stay there, there's something wrong with you. But we really do believe that we don't have to keep building the kind of communities that either exclude us on purpose or just by association, make us feel like there's nothing to look forward to in there. And that we can prove the model that we can make the kind of communities that show that you don't have to move out of your neighborhood to live in a better one. And I just want to thank you, IIDA, for including me again in your work.
Thanks, Majora, for that illuminating conversation. The context of us having the power to change our communities and the discussion around retaining talent as a means of community development and community improvement was certainly intriguing. I'm so honored to be joined by Ronnie Belizaire, who is the current president of the board of IIDA, and Dr. Angie Scott with the International Well Building Institute, for some follow-up conversation. And I just want to kind of open up this conversation to just getting some reaction from the both of you around Majora's premise of community development and talent retention. And I love that notion of we all come from some place. And sometimes we go back to those places to bring our energy and our talent. How do we think that folks are reclaiming their communities? And I'd love for both of you to give some reaction to Majora's presentation. Dr. Angie, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I really loved the different terms that she used. Low status neighborhoods, talent retention was really exciting for me, thinking about that concept in terms of retaining our people who are native to our neighborhoods and bringing those talents back into those spaces to create a vibrant community for the things that we want to see in the other communities that we go to gain those. One of the things that I've really been seeing and I'm very excited about is people really starting to take the things that they want to see into their own hands and actually realizing that in their communities, whether that is setting up pop-up stores or flea markets as Majora referred to. You were just talking to us about someone who had just created a roving bookstore in the Bronx, and so really understanding that they can do anything that they set their minds to, and really taking the lead and control of what that destiny looks like for their neighborhoods and bringing that power back into their neighborhoods and not really leaving it up to others to do that for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. If I really think about what Majora said and then kind of piggybacking off of what Dr. Angie said, watching people recognize the value that exists in their own communities is a beautiful thing, right? I can't say that I've always been cognizant of it, but for the past few years, as my work has involved development in some way, shape, or form, I've recognized that, oh, wow, community members actually really understand the gold mine that is their communities, and they don't want to just give it away for pennies to what might be millions later on. And if more communities could be educated in that way, and sometimes that education comes from within, and sometimes it takes someone who has a good heart to come from outside and say, hey, before you agree to this, let me talk to you about what value you have here. When there's fresh running water in your community, that's a great resource. People just have to recognize that for themselves. And so I just love seeing local community members recognizing that and recognizing I'm not just going to walk away because dollars were thrown at me. And at that point, dollars that undervalue what I know is valuable.
Mhm, mhm. These conversations around community building and kind of turning that tide of disinvestment and reinvesting in communities, they're design conversations, quite honestly, right? And when we talk about, right, we all love to use the term stakeholder, but we're talking about, when we're talking about stakeholders, we're talking about the people who live in these and thrive in these communities, and not just a single generation. Sometimes, multiple generations. Majora referenced her father, who came to the Bronx as a Pullman porter, and had multiple jobs, throughout the 40s and the 50s, married her mom, found the house ultimately, but leased it back to the people that he bought it from, until they could move into that house. So we're talking about multiple generations in communities, but we also know, in maybe shifting the conversation to one about sustainability, that Black and Brown communities are more adversely affected by climate change and wasteful living in neighborhoods. So when we're thinking about designing sustainably, how can we better factor in the impact on communities? And the piece of that, right, the piece of that also that Majora talked about was exposing that beautiful park by the river, right? And so thinking about how we factor in nature as part of the conversation around sustainable design. Ronnie or Angie?
Go ahead, Ronnie.
I would, if we think about us as designers and we really think about interior designers, by the time that conversation, we know about that conversation, a lot has already occurred, right? But if we could be, truth seers, and we could say, hey, how do we impact what happens in someone's experience day to day, whether it's working with the urban planners at our firms or working with the base building architects in our firm. I think getting people to actually engage as part of that community at first would be great, right? Whether it's a creek cleanup nearby, or if it's a trash pickup day, or something that gets them to start to, even if they don't live in that community, but the community that they're impacting, if they start to understand what it means to live a life in that community, I think it holistically makes us think better about the community that we're planning for. And then how do we get our clients to also understand that? Because most of the time we're working for large clients who might not necessarily be tethered to the community, aside from them saying, I'm building a building here. But how do we start to tell that story and make it a more holistic one? And how do we start to get our clients to start to say, how do we take this community and bring it inside of our campus, right? Sometimes for security reasons, some companies, it has to be a closed campus, but not all of them have to be, or certain portions of it could be open. So for the full life cycle of that community, can we find ways to infuse pockets of open campuses that allow the community in? And while that may not necessarily be speaking specifically to the green story, it's allowing for community members to start to see how their resources can be used and can be seen through the lens of potential development in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
I would just want to add to what Ronnie is saying, bringing in research into this conversation. I always have to do that. There's a lot of research that talks about nature and the benefits on people in general. We know that, we've known that for a while now. But I don't know if the general public understands how great of an impact nature has on people. So if we as designers are educated with that research and are armed with that research to be able to say to our clients, look, there are studies that show that there is less crime when you have green spaces built into your communities. There is more creativity and resiliency that happens when you are exposed to nature. There's a better sense of or a higher quality of life and a better sense of well-being when you have nature built into your communities and you're exposed to that. And then also understanding that layer, that intersectionality, right, of layering on the people who have the least, and many times who don't have this access to nature may need it the most. Even talking about healing. And so having that information as a designer or someone in the practitioner in the built environment to be able to take that directly to their clients to say, look, this is helpful to you, and especially helpful to your community. Let's see how we can incorporate this into the master plan. I think also with those conversations, really helping or guiding the community to understand, look, we're going back to your roots, as Indigenous people, we have, and all of us at some point, were Indigenous. So going back to our human roots, but, if we're talking about communities that are often brown and Black that are suffering from these issues, coming back to that connection to nature is very important, and it's innate in us and a part of our ancestry. So I think also just bringing that story back into play is very important to show that we have always been connected. Let's come back.
And Angie, when you say that, I think about circularity as we're talking about sustainability, right? And so a lot of times I say to myself, especially if you recognize what the Indigenous roots are in your community. I love seeing that there are organizations starting to do land acknowledgements to at least say, we know there was something here before we were here, and here's how we honor that thing. I think all that's part of the green story, the sustainability story. So being able to make sure that we as designers are thoughtful, and if our clients don't recognize that, being able to tell our clients, FYI, here's what existed here before you got here. And is there a way we can incorporate some version of that history or acknowledge that history as part of this design storytelling?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that spurs healing. And I think Majora talked about that too in her talk.
Yeah, she did. She invoked the word healing, and not necessarily that she wanted to necessarily aggressively right the wrongs of the previous era, like redlining. She was super focused on outcomes. And I thought one of the points that I appreciated that she made is she said, kind of revitalizing this community wasn't necessarily going to bring talent, creative talent, for example, there. It was going to energize the talent that already existed there. And she said that's what people often overlook. Is she said, we have filmmakers, we have restaurateurs, we have a creative community that just needs to be evidenced. We love it when new people are moving in. That happens in neighborhoods, but we also want the creative community, the talent that's already there, to be richly realized and validated. And, that's one of the most powerful things I think about design and community building, is that it is so validating for humanity. How do you have that conversation, right? It's the eternal question. How do you have that conversation with clients about that power that design has?
When I'm talking about design to clients, I ask them, the room that we are sitting in right now, how does that make you feel? How does it make you feel when you walk into your home? Are there spaces that you walked in that just made you feel amazing? Are there spaces that you walked in that make you feel like you want to leave immediately? That's the power of design. We have the ability to create spaces that can impact you mentally, physically, spiritually, socially, emotionally. And once people are in those spaces and can feel exactly what you're talking about, the reaction I get 100% of the time is, oh, I never thought about it that way. You're right. I do feel, and they begin to tell me stories about how they felt when they were in some space, negatively or positively. And so I think really just bringing it back to them, relating it back to their lives and their stories, something that they can relate to, is a very effective way of just the introduction there. And then we can continue on with that discussion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting. I started my career as a healthcare designer. So the first 4 years of my career, I did healthcare work. And in designing hospitals or, working with health practitioners, it's all about how they want people to feel in the space, right? So whether it's a NICU that, is taking care of preemies, that you've got sad parents wondering if their little baby's going to hold on, how do we brighten their day through the physical space? Or if it's someone who is, end of life, we know that their elder might be passing away soon. How do you create a space that helps invoke the emotions that we know they're going to experience, but that space supports those emotions? And so, I was lucky. I started my career in healthcare, and then I took some of those same principles when I moved into corporate design to start to say to clients as I'm doing the programming, what do you want people to feel in this, right? And to your point, Dr. Angie, it's always what do you mean what do I want people to feel? I just want this to be a place where people come in and they do their work. And I'm like, all right, well, what do you think motivates people to do their work? Do you think the built environment has an impact on them? And I ask those questions as thought-provoking ones to help challenge them to say whatever they thought they put on paper when they created that RFP that then I responded to and they hired me off of. Does that paper reflect what you're really trying to achieve here? And what you're trying to achieve is you want a space that helps promote a feeling, whatever that feeling is, but you have to know what it is that you're trying to evoke through your built environment. And so I think being able to ask that question is probably one of the most important parts of the programming process. What do you want this space to evoke? How do you want people to feel? And different departments, different people that you're programming for are going to have different needs, right? And so it's like, oh, okay, well, this is supposed to be joyous. This space is like the sales, the hunters of the organization. This piece of the organization are the marketers. So each one of them has a very unique way in which they do the work that they do. So how do we navigate making sure that the spaces evoke the feeling that helps them do their best work?
And can I add too? I also add that if money was not a factor, how would this space feel for you? Like if you could have anything you wanted and you wanted to live your best existence in this space, what would that then be? Because I really am a big proponent of not just being okay and settling, and a lot of times when you're talking to people who don't have experience with design, they'll say, oh, I just want my house to look nice, or I just want to feel good, or they kind of shoot them for the bare minimums usually. And I want them to really think about, we don't want to just exist, we want to thrive in our spaces. And so really kind of looking at this from less from a pathogenic perspective and more to a salutogenic perspective, where we're really shooting for optimal living in space.
Yeah. And Majora talked a bit about places. I think when she was talking about, was it Bronxlandia, places that could inspire the community, places where people could come to be inspired, right? There was a cause and effect piece there. Let's talk a little bit about this notion. In recent history, we've talked about belonging in the context of EDI. We've talked about how it feels to belong. It is not a new conversation. It took on kind of a higher level of import over the last few years because of the pandemic, because of cultural inequities, because of social unrest. But it's still a prevalent question, I know, that designers are getting. How do you craft and create space that everybody feels as if they belong, right? There's no handbook or guidebook on, the science, the art and science of belonging. We all know what belonging feels like. We know what not belonging feels like. How has that conversation affected both of you and your work as designers? And do you feel truly that it is possible to create spaces where people feel that they belong?
I'll kind of take this back to my childhood, then bring it back to, I remember growing up in South Florida, it's a melting pot, right? Everybody, even if we're all Black, everybody's parents come from somewhere else. Or if someone looks Hispanic, just because they're Hispanic doesn't mean they're the same type of Hispanic. And I learned that at a very early age, but it's interesting until I got to middle school and we had magnet programs and people were busting from different communities, and that was their way of starting to desegregate. And so they would bring in people from certain communities, mainly white students, to Black schools, and a little of the vice versa. I happened to live in a mixed community. It was mixed income in every sense of the word. There was no gate around our community. There was no call button for someone to let you inside of a gate. But when I got to middle school, I had a couple of friends who lived in those types of communities. And it was me recognizing, oh my God, are we not good enough? Why don't we have a gate? Because in my mind, I equated that to, oh, they must be better than us if there's someone protecting the outside from coming in. And I'm so happy that, I let go of that notion pretty early on, because I realized they were just human beings just like me. And so I think more than anything, design has the power to make someone feel as if they belong or don't belong. And that comes to being contextual to the community that they are, the materiality that's used. Are you saying someone is welcome here? Is a big deal in design. And some of our clients will be honest, no, I don't want anybody else here but us, right? And then some are like, no, we want the community to be a part of this. All right, well, this fortress that I'm kind of creating via glass is not saying you want the community to come in. So how do we juxtapose this with the notion of what you want? And so, they start to then think. Some of them, they think in a way where it becomes, oh, wait, well, let's change that. That's not the narrative. That's not the story I want to tell. But then there are others, no, that is what they want. They want people to not feel it's easy for them to just walk and access their buildings. So you can't, there's no one solution for all clients, right? And I keep thinking about the commercial environment space that I live in the build. I'm really working on commercial and corporate clients. I don't really work on residential, but if I take some of in my own personal living experience and what those physical barriers that were presented to make me feel like I didn't belong, I don't want that to be what I design for clients. And so I try to always, ask the probing questions. Why do you think you need to be protected from the outside? Or what does this materiality say about you saying someone belongs here or don't belong here?
Dr. Angie?
Yeah, Ronnie touched on some really great points. When you said physical barriers, I even thought about, just visual barriers that are cues that are barriers, I think one of the things that we can do is talk to people, and that's simple to say, but it's more complex than that. I think that as designers, we have to understand that we have to reach beyond who we traditionally speak to understand what we want the space to look and feel like. So if you're constantly talking to a homogeneous group of people, they're going to mainly tell you the similar things. You're going to see those similar patterns. If you expand that conversation to people that come from different backgrounds and different communities and start to understand what belonging feels like to them, you will be able to expand your repertoire, your tools that you could use to create a space that most people, the majority of people, may feel like they're included. So as Ronnie said, it's still going to look different depending on the job, the scope of the project. But you will have an opportunity to really create a space that more people can feel as though they belong there when you're able to then use different types of patterns or textures or colors or doing different types of using different type of line with the architectural features or the design elements in the space. So I think having those blind spots is actually a handicap for us as designers, but really starting to think more expansively of how can I call in more people to understand what it is that would make people feel like they belong to space.
Yeah. Dr.
And
Angie,
I think
prior to your, I'm sorry, Ronnie, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add on to that. If I think about my design education and it being very Eurocentric, I started my career with a lens of Eurocentric design aesthetics were what belonged, right? And as I grew as a professional, as I understood my own power a bit more, I started to say, oh, that was a book that was teaching me this thing, but human experience says this actually matters more. And how do you infuse all of that into what it is that we do on a daily basis? So it's quite interesting. And I think what we learn in design school starts to impact us in ways, if we're not careful, that make us homogeneous designers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are
Yeah.
pieces too that really, nature is going to be something that's going to draw everybody. Having a sense of control are things that are going to draw everyone in. So there are different elements that you can incorporate into design that really, as human beings, we all are going to have an affinity to.
Ronnie, you're helping me where I was going to go with a question with Dr. Angie prior to her being at IWBI. She was a design educator. And so, Dr. Angie, in any of your work with your students, did this notion of belongingness, did you have this conversation with students about designing to belong?
Absolutely. I don't know if I use that term belong.
Right.
But I always talked about culture.
Yeah.
And I've been calling it cultural well-being for a very long time now. And so what I did is I thought it was very important for my students to be exposed to different cultures and understand that everyone has a different story, and those stories aren't wrong. They're just different, and they should all be celebrated. And so how can we speak to, learn from, bring in other groups that are different from our own, and understand what issues are important to them, understand the barriers that have impacted how they live in space, and what we can do as designers, going back to the power of design, what we can do as designers to eliminate those barriers in space to make sure that they feel like they belong too. So I always talk to my students about the normal bell curve and ensuring that we're not just designing for the median, but we're designing for the extremes. So the people who have the least and the people who have the most, whatever population that we're referencing, should be included in those conversations to ensure that, in fact, everyone is being accounted for in how we design space. I talk to my students about how the impact of manufacturing and the different products that we specify have an impact on different communities, a negative impact on different communities, and how can we as designers make a difference to create a better living environment and the environment for those communities as well. So I've always infuse those conversations into everything that I did. I thought that was very important, not only for my students of color or from different culture and backgrounds to feel included just being in that classroom, because they're usually surrounded by people or they're usually the minority in those classrooms. But I also equally thought it was important for my students who were the majority, and usually they were white women, for them to understand it as well, so that we are all armed with those tools as we go out into practice and take those ideas with them.
Kind of staying in that lane of education, I thought it was really interesting when Majora was talking about, looking at the Bronx and the community, like, there are markers, there are things that are indicative of, as she termed it, low status communities. So a prevalence of liquor stores, a prevalence of check cashing places, places like Rent-A-Center, right? The places that use your money instead of you using your money. And so she talked about kind of the replacing of some of those instances with places that teach financial literacy, teach you how to get a home loan, how to have better credit. And so I was struck by that as part of community building, and when we're inviting stakeholders in on a project or a development, educating communities about design. Is that something that you think we're seeing more of in helping folks understand and maybe not the intricacies of the design process per se, but that design is as much a tool for them. It's a power tool, right? And so, how do we have these conversations? Because often designers aren't necessarily on those front lines where they're working with those stakeholders, but how important is using the education about design important in community building? And how is it possible and doable?
Yeah, I was very lucky. The most recent work that I was doing, unfortunately, I can't say the name of it because of NDAs. The most recent work I was doing was very early on community development conversations related to corporate development that was coming online. And we actually planned for a design charrette with community members. We had two different versions of design charrette. One that was with kids in the community. And when we say kids, up until high school, elementary school through high school, letting them play around with things to say, if you're building your community, what would you do? And then obviously the adults in the community, which they see in a very different way, in a different lens. And it's amazing how you take these two very different groups based on age and life experience, how they interpreted their own community and what they wanted to see in their community. The adults really focused on the things that the limits they put on themselves, as we know money is going to be an issue, so we can't have this, we can't have that. And they focused on the can'ts, and if we can overcome the can'ts, versus the kids who were like, pie in the sky, hey, I want this. Can I get spaceship to do this? And you're like, wow, but it's amazing, not that we could make the amazingness of what the kids wanted to figure out come to life, but it's amazing to try to turn around the adults by saying, hey, here's what the children were thinking, and getting them to see things. So I think design charrettes are a great way to get people into, and they might not understand a design process. It's okay. You don't have to go into anything lengthy with them. It's just a matter of putting all these different voices in rooms where they can hear what other people think, and they start to see, oh, wow, our community is quite diverse from a way we think standpoint, right? Not just the way we look, but the way we think. Because some people, depending on what your profession is, you're going to have different ways that you interpret what it is that you want to see. So I think design charrettes are a great way to get people into the thinking, the design process, without necessarily saying, let me teach you design principles and how you go about doing design.
Yeah. I love that idea of a community design charrette. It also is exposing kids to the potential of design as a career. It just gets them started asking questions and seeing design in action. Dr. Angie?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Ronnie's saying, I love design charrettes as well. And I think that they're very important, especially when you're coming to building spaces for communities. And I think part of, in addition to what Ronnie's saying, I think part of that is empowering the community when they are there. So they are not there just to check off a box. And we just want you to just listen to what all the experts have to say. Their voices really should be centered as the experts of that community, and be empowered that they do have tools that can really lend to creating spaces that are highly successful and functional and beautiful for them. I think back again, kind of going back to before we had architects and designers, there were master builders, and as Ronnie said, people from different types of the arts, building arts that crafted things in the built environment. And so just reminding people that you do have something to contribute. You do have a history of this. And we're not here just to say that you came, but we're here because we really want to hear and center your voices.
I also, in Majora's presentation, appreciated how she didn't show all the positives either. She showed herself being, and her efforts being protested. The last part of her presentation, she talked about a development project that didn't go in the direction that she wanted. She had some very definitive opinions about what that project should be and could be, and was very honest about that. So I also like that flavor that she showed, two sides to every coin, but her work certainly is admirable, and would love for both of you to just give us some closing thoughts on what you heard Majora say, and what does this mean for the future of community building and its partnership with design? Who wants to jump in with some closing thoughts?
Go ahead, Ronnie.
Yeah. I love how she passed that torch to you, Ronnie. Yeah.
If I think about all of the stories that were shared in Majora's presentation to us, I think the most important thing to glean from that is you just have to show up. You have to be a part of the discussion, because if you're not part of the discussion, then things are happening to you instead of you influencing the things that happen around you. So I would say anyone who might be thinking, oh, their voice is a bit too small to take on this big notion of community development, but really it's each one teach one. I think about my neighborhood and seeing the little, and a lot of neighborhoods have this, but the little mailbox library, where they kind of put the books in and people kind of just the honor system of the notebook, the books, and people, oh, let me check this out, or oh, let me add to it. And being able to, see that it's not saying that someone can't still physically go to a library. It's saying I'm bringing it closer to you. And maybe this will help entice you to say, where is my big public library? Where can I get more books, right? And so, someone just thought of that idea, and then it sprung and it turned into something that happens in various neighborhoods across the country. And so you have to start somewhere. And I think Majora's presentation leads you to believe a small seed can sprout a huge idea that can come to life. And sometimes with plants, when you're planting them, they die along the way, but then they grow back, and it all depends on the season and how much you water them. So if you focus on that, then it's cyclical and you can always be a part of the story.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Ronnie. And Dr. Angie?
Yeah, I really love the idea of this talent retention for communities. I really, I just smiled when she said that. I'm originally from St. Paul, Minnesota, where we don't have a large population of Black people, but it's a very tight-knit community, and we all know each other. And there's beauty in that, but there's something that we always complain about, is that we don't have, such and such here in our communities. We don't, we need this, we need that. And oftentimes there was a feeling of having to, or feeling like you needed to leave in order to, really make it, and not stay in the community and really invest in our neighborhood. And so it really touched me what she was saying about that, just building these spaces that we all want the same things, right? Innately as human beings, we want spaces, these third places where we can go and have a cup of coffee, or go to a nice restaurant, or, hang out with our friends or community. And so instead of always leaving, let's see how we can build those things in our own neighborhoods, and know that we don't have to go out and search for something more. We have what we need already in our communities.
Yeah, that's nicely said, both of you. And her point about reclaiming our communities, that we're sometimes often the victim of expectations, right? What is around us affects us. And if we're surrounded by chaos and brutality, there are moments where we begin to believe that that's what's in store for us, or that's what we deserve. And so her message about empowerment and being powerful and reclaiming our communities, and it's always predicated in design and humanity. And so I'm very honored that Majora joined us for the presentation, and to have two very powerful women, Ronnie Belizaire and Dr. Angie Scott, for some post-presentation commentary. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us for this episode of Collective Design. Stay powerful, everyone. Cheers to each of you, and thanks for connecting with IIDA, and we'll see you again soon.